"Seymour, you look like you've swallowed a cloud and it's about to burst into flames," came the mocking voice of Bennett, my longtime partner, as I stood transfixed in the middle of our charity gala, which had brought together all the titans of Wall Street. My flawless, billion-dollar life began to crumble as soon as I read the anonymous message on my secure private phone: "Your legend is built on bones. Freedom's shield is a zero balance. All 300 million is gone. Enjoy your champagne, Seymour." I apologize, but I didn't swallow a cloud, Bennett. I swallowed morphine mixed with dust and ambition, and now it was taking effect, paralyzing my ability to breathe or think logically. The fund I had founded and nurtured as proof of my humanity, ironic, of course, but necessary for my public image, had turned out to be an empty Pandora's box, and I now understood that this was not just a theft but a carefully planned diversion aimed not at my money but at the death of my reputation. "Heart trouble, Bennett, the good old American disease, too much success, too little sleep," I replied, feeling my face, a mask of iron confidence, begin to crack, but I could not afford to give up, because here were everyone who could either destroy me or elevate me, and at this moment my every move was a public announcement. The disappearance of 300 million was not just a hole in the budget, it was a sentence, because this fund had been my shield, a symbol that my capital had a conscience, and now that shield had fallen, leaving me to face the sharks I had fed for so many years. I knew instantly that this was the work of someone close to me, someone who knew my every weakness, every password, every secret protocol. This was not an attack but a surgical intervention into the very fabric of my financial and moral existence, and the only thing I felt was a cold, searing anger that demanded not revenge but immediate understanding of who, and most importantly, why, had decided to destroy me right now, at the height of my fame. I walked away from the desk, as if heading for the ladies' room, but in reality I was walking into a dark, remote hallway where I could dial the only number that could give me answers, my chief IT security officer, Richard, and when he answered, I didn't ask, I stated, "Richard, we're screwed. The foundation. Check all transaction records for the last 72 hours, and remember, if it's one of ours, there's no second chance for them." My hand gripped the phone so tightly that I could feel the glass shattering, and in that moment, staring at my successful face reflected in the dark glass, I realized that loneliness and fear were the only currencies left in the pockets of the rich when their empires began to crumble. $300 million for veterans was my perfect, but false, redemption story, and now someone had decided it was time to end it. The next morning, Richard, my hacker with the impeccable reputation and the perpetually existentially bored expression, sat across from me in my penthouse, not even trying to hide the fear in his eyes, which to him was tantamount to a public confession of treason. "It's not just a conclusion, Seymour. They used the Orion Protocol, the same one we agreed to forget after the '98 affair. It's like a signature, like a black signature on a white collar. The transactions didn't come from the fund, they came through the fund, and it was perfectly clean, like it was just a clearinghouse. Of course, I could have covered it all up, poured millions in offshore, but..." He paused, and the pause was louder than the stock market crash. "They beat me to it. 20 minutes ago, an anonymous letter landed on the desk of the editor of the New York Ledger. Not $300 million, but the moral gray areas of my company, with specific dates and names I thought I had erased from my memory forever, our first deal that allowed me to become Seymour. I felt the steel frame of my confidence buckle. This was no ordinary theft, but an act of historical retribution, and it meant that the enemy was not just a thief but someone with access to my past, which I had carefully packaged into the myth of the self-made billionaire. I remembered that deal, the family business we had swallowed, leaving its owner with nothing but lawsuits and a broken life, and it suddenly became clear to me that the American dream is always a dream of some, built on the nightmares of others, and that my success was as fragile as the one I had crushed. When I tried to contact Bennett, my vice president, he didn't answer, and I realized that the first rat had abandoned ship without waiting for a public sinking. I looked out at the evening Manhattan, at the lights that had once seemed like my crown, and felt a cold sweat betray my iron will. The headlines were already flashing on the television, which was on silent: "Freedom's Shield Fund under suspicion, where's the money?" But the biggest shock came when I opened my safe, where I kept the only tangible evidence of my long-standing guilt, the notebook of the former owner of the company I had destroyed. The notebook was empty. This was not a revelation, this was a declaration of war, and the enemy had taken not the money, but my only guarantee of silence. The moment I realized that my reputation, my most precious asset, had been shattered into dust, the only thing left was a deep, desperate urge to fight, because Seymour could not afford to die without a fight. I spent the next 48 hours in self-imposed exile, sitting in my old house on Long Island, which I had left 20 years before when I decided that real life was possible only at the top of a skyscraper. It was my grandfather's house, not pompous, but permeated with the smell of oil and the honest work that I had so quickly traded for easy money and glitter. The phone kept ringing, journalists, lawyers, angry investors, but I listened only to the silence of the place. I was a dethroned king, and the only one who had not yet turned away was Richard, who continued to track the Orion from my penthouse as if guarding the ashes of a dead god. Just when I thought I was truly alone in this game, there she was, standing on my old wooden porch, a woman whose face I hadn't seen in 20 years but whose silhouette I could recognize in a million, Sarah, the daughter of the very owner whose company I had crushed in the prime of my career, leaving her a penniless orphan. She stood there in a simple coat, her eyes, as they had 20 years ago, filled not with anger but with a deep, weary understanding. My father, whom you so deftly erased from history, left behind more than just a notebook, Seymour, she said, her voice as calm as ice. He left me the truth about how you run your business. I know about Orion, I know about the fund, and I know you're not alone. Bennett is just a pawn. The real architect lies deeper, and he uses your guilt, your American need for redemption, as leverage. I stared at her, stunned, expecting either accusations or demands for money, but she came with a proposition that turned my internal understanding of this war upside down. I want justice, not revenge, she said, and in that moment I realized that I was not a victim but an unexpected, only possible ally whose motive was purer than my billions. Sarah pulled a small, battered recorder from her bag, on which her father's conversations had been recorded, which clearly indicated a monopoly cartel that was using my foundation not just for laundering money but to finance a shadowy political campaign aimed at taking over federal energy contracts. They don't just steal, Seymour, they buy the country, she whispered, and the note became forbidden knowledge that explained why the Orion was so pure. They were using my own myth against me. At that moment, my vision of the world, where I was the most intelligent predator, collapsed, and I realized that I was just a screen, the perfect victim for their final act. With the advent of Sarah and her audio recordings, the war ceased to be a question of money and became a question of moral choice, the same one that the American mentality always forces us to make when we are at a crossroads between profit and righteousness. I sat with Richard and Sarah in the shadow of my once all-powerful corporate tower, reviewing the details of the final transaction that was to take place in 48 hours, the final, largest transfer of funds that would give the cartel complete control. Richard rubbed his hands nervously as he surveyed the scheme. We can stop this, Seymour, we can hack into the Orion protocol and redirect the funds to the Federal Reserve, but that requires open access to your main server, and that means revealing everything, including your past sins, your role in founding the fund, and our hack. You lose everything, your reputation, your business, and possibly your freedom, Seymour. They will use your old mistakes to discredit today's truth. I felt a searing pain in my chest, but it wasn't the pain of fear for my capital, but the sharp remorse of having spent so many years believing that the end justified the means, that success was the only measure of my dignity. I looked at Sarah, at her restrained dignity, and realized that it was my own sins that had created the monster that now threatened not only me but the very idea that honesty could exist in this country. I can't let them win, Richard. I built this system, and I must destroy it. My voice was calmer than ever, because when you've lost everything, fear becomes meaningless. You know what to do. We're going to intervene in Orion. Let the world know that even the richest can have a spine. Sarah placed her hand on mine, and the gesture was more powerful than any contract. She agreed to testify, knowing that it would put her own life at risk, but her determination was my moral anchor. The time had come for me to stand up to the man I had hidden inside me for so long, the selfish, invincible billionaire Seymour, and do what he would never do, sacrifice everything for the greater truth. I knew I was finished as a financial magnate, but the moment I made that decision, I felt a heavy cloak of lies and grandeur fall from my shoulders. This was my final, redemptive fight, and I was willing to pay whatever the price. As the sun rose over New York, illuminating the gilded towers that had once been my fiefdom, I sat in a small, unremarkable room in the federal prosecutor's office. Orion had worked flawlessly. The transaction had been stopped, the funds had been diverted, and the names of the cartel's organizers, including Bennett, were now on the front pages of newspapers, tarnished and exposed. But with them came my headline, in big, bold letters, Billionaire Whistleblower, The Price of Redemption. I had lost everything, Just as Richard had predicted, my assets were frozen, my company was under investigation, and my name had become synonymous with both brilliant success and profound moral ambiguity. My confession did not spare my old sins, acknowledging that great power always requires dirty hands, and that I had pretended my hands were clean for too long. Sarah sat next to me, her face haggard, but without triumph. There was only a quiet, bitter truth. "Your father would be proud," I whispered, and they were probably the most honest words I had ever spoken in my life. She just shook her head. "He would have liked you to have understood this sooner, Seymour. So that you wouldn't have waited until the world was falling apart to make the right choice. That is the true American tragedy. We wait until the last moment before we put human dignity above profit." She was right. My final act was not an act of heroism, but an act of cleansing from the years of moral blindness that my boundless wealth had fostered. I walked out of the building not a billionaire, but simply a man in an expensive but now pointless suit, looking out at the rain falling on Manhattan. I had saved the country from a cynical conspiracy, but I had not saved myself from responsibility. Is it possible to be rich and honest? I could only answer, yes, but probably not for long. The truth weighs too much to be held together with billions. I had lost an empire, but I had found something much rarer in my world, inner peace. I stood in the rain, no longer having a driver or a bodyguard, and the only thought that pulsed through my head was the philosophical irony that in order to become truly free, I had to lose everything I had tried so desperately to buy. Now that the story is complete, would you like to discuss its moral dilemma, or perhaps create another story with a different theme?